The gun was already at his temple when she stepped between them. "Move," Colt Hargrove growled, his voice a low, dangerous thing that had made harder men than her step aside. His eyes were cold silver in the fading afternoon light, and the barrel of his Colt's single-action army did not waver a single inch, but she did not move. Nora Langley stood with her back to the man she was shielding, her hands raised not in surrender but in absolute refusal, her dark hair loose and wild from the ride that had brought her here to this particular intersection of fate and desperation. There was dust on her boots, blood on the hem of her dress, and the kind of look on her face that only comes from a woman who has been pushed so far past the edge of what she can endure that fear has simply run out of room inside her. "You will have to shoot through me," she said, and her voice did not shake. It was Garrett Thorne who froze then, not the man behind her, not the gathered crowd on the main street of Redemption, Texas, pressing back against the storefronts in collective held breath. It was the gunslinger himself, the man they called Ghost for the way he could walk into trouble and walk back out again leaving nothing but aftermath, who felt something inside his chest lock up like a rusted mechanism that hadn't been touched in years. He had never hesitated before. Not once in 11 years of drawing iron for money, for justice, for survival, had he ever hesitated. He lowered the gun, not because the man behind her deserved mercy, not because the crowd was watching, not because some softness had overtaken him in that moment of her impossible, furious, beautiful bravery. He lowered it because she looked at him like she would genuinely die before she moved, and something that lived behind his ribs absolutely refused to let that happen. "Get away from him," Garrett said, quieter now, the danger somehow more present in the softness of it. "Not until you tell me what he did," she said. "He's a thief and a liar, and that's the least of it. Then there's a proper way to handle it, and this is not it." The man behind her, a wiry, trembling excuse for a human being named Percy Vine, made the profound mistake of trying to run. He took one step to the left, one hand gripping the back of Nora's dress to use her as a shield in reverse, and in the half-second it took for that decision to register on everyone's face, Garrett was already moving. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, caught Vine's wrist, and wrenched him sideways with the efficient economy of motion of a man who had done this 1,000 times, sending him sprawling into the dust without once touching the woman standing between them. Nora spun around, breathing hard. Garrett looked at her over the heap of the man he'd just deposited in the street, and for just one moment, neither of them said anything at all. That was 3 weeks ago. This is the story of what happened before, and what happened after, and how 2 very damaged people managed to find their way to something neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. The summer of 1882 arrived in Redemption, Texas, the way most things arrived in that part of the country, loud, hot, and uninvited. The town sat at the intersection of 2 cattle trails and 1 bad idea, which was roughly how most of the towns in that stretch of the Edwards Plateau had been founded. It had a post office, a general store, 2 saloons, a Methodist church that was perpetually under repair, a livery stable, a hotel that rented rooms by the day or the hour and did not ask questions either way, and a jail that was occupied more often than not. What it did not have, until the morning of June the 3rd, was Nora Langley. She arrived on the afternoon stage from San Antonio, which made its stop in Redemption at 2:30, and then continued northwest toward Del Rio. She was the only passenger who got off. She stepped down from the coach with a leather traveling bag in one hand and a hat box in the other, and she stood in the middle of the main street for exactly 12 seconds, before she seemed to make some internal decision and started walking toward the general store. She was 24 years old, though she carried herself with the careful stillness of someone considerably older. She had dark eyes, the kind that people sometimes described as serious, though she would have said simply that she had learned to pay attention. She was wearing a sensible gray traveling dress with a single row of black buttons down the front, and a jacket that she already regretted in the June heat. She was, by any reasonable measure, a woman who did not stand out particularly, right up until the moment she opened her mouth. "I am looking for work," she told the storekeeper, a broad-shouldered man named Arthur Crane who had the suspicious, appraising look of a man who had seen too many people pass through his town looking for something they were not going to find here. "What kind of work?" Arthur asked. "Practical work. I can keep books, I can cook, I can manage accounts, I can sew, I can teach, and I can also handle a rifle at moderate range, though I understand that is not typically listed as a qualification for most civilian employment." Arthur Crane blinked. "You got family here?" "No." "Friends?" "Not yet." Running from something, she looked at him evenly. "Arriving towards something, there is a difference." He hired her to manage his accounts that same afternoon, mostly because his records were, in his own words, a disaster that would bring tears to a bookkeeper's eyes, and she had not blinked once when she looked at the state of them. She found lodgings at the boarding house run by a widow named Clara Finch, who charged $8 a month for a room and 2 meals a day, and asked considerably fewer questions than Arthur Crane, which Nora appreciated. Her room was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the backyard garden, and on her first night she sat on the edge of the bed in the near dark and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of everything she had left behind. Her mother's house in Austin, sold to pay her father's debts after he died. The employment at the schoolhouse, terminated without explanation the week after she refused a proposal from the school board chairman. A man named Harold Peck, who had a wife and 3 children and saw nothing complicated in the situation at all. The man she had almost married, one Marcus Webb, who had turned out to have a second life in Houston that included commitments he had declined to mention during their 2-year courtship. She had found out 3 weeks before the wedding, and she had spent the first week after that unable to eat, the second week furious, and the third week making arrangements. Redemption was not a destination so much as a starting point. She was good at starting over. She had been doing it in various forms since she was 17, when her father's drinking had first made the walls of their home feel like something to escape rather than return to. She had never once had someone who stayed, someone who chose her when choosing her was the harder option. Someone who planted their feet and said, "This woman, I will not let the world take her from me." She had spent a great deal of her 24 years being very quietly, very stoically, unsurprised by that fact. Then she met Garrett Thorne, and everything she had decided about the world began to come apart at the seams. He arrived in Redemption on the 7th of June, 4 days after she did, which meant that by the time he rode his dark roan horse down the main street at dusk, she was already standing behind the counter at Crane's general store, and she saw him through the window. He was tall, which was the first thing she noticed. Not in the dramatic, storybook way of the dime novels she had occasionally read during the years she worked at the schoolhouse, but in the practical, physical way of a man whose height was simply a fact about him, like the color of his eyes or the set of his jaw. He wore a long canvas duster despite the heat, trail dusty and worn at the cuffs, and a hat pulled low enough that the shadow from the brim cut across the upper half of his face. He rode with the relaxed, spine-straight posture of someone who had spent so many hours in a saddle that the horse had simply become part of his natural geography. He did not look toward the store window. He did not look at anything in particular. He rode the length of the main street at a slow walk and disappeared in the direction of the livery, and Nora returned to the column of figures she was totaling and told herself she had not been watching. She heard his name for the first time the next morning. The silence that followed was the particular kind that carries information. "Who is Garrett Thorne?" Nora asked, because she was new enough that she could ask that without it being remarkable. "Gunslinger," Tommy said, in a voice that managed to convey both respect and wariness in equal measure. "Worked for the Rangers for a time. Goes his own way now. Does bounty work mostly. They say he has never missed a man he was sent after. They also say he is not particularly concerned with the condition of the man when he delivers him," Dov added, with the tone of a man who was enjoying the drama of the information. "They say a great many things," Edith Parr said briskly, and returned to her eggs. "Most of what they say is half true at best." Nora filed this information in the same place she filed most things. Useful to know, not yet relevant, and went to work. She met him properly that afternoon. She was coming out of the post office with a letter she had collected for Arthur Crane, when she nearly walked directly into him. He was coming from the opposite direction, and they both stopped with perhaps a foot of space between them, the kind of near collision that happens in busy places to people moving quickly, though in this case neither of them was moving particularly fast. Nora looked up. He looked down. She had the brief and irrational impression of a man who was measuring the distance between 2 points and had not yet decided whether to cross it. "Excuse me," she said. "My fault," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with laziness. She had time to note that his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she did not have an immediate name for, that he looked perhaps 30, perhaps 32, and that there was a quality about his stillness that was different from calmness in a way she could not yet articulate. She stepped to the right. He stepped to the left. They blocked each other again. A different kind of man would have made it charming, perhaps laughed, said something clever. Garrett Thorne simply paused, recalculated, and stepped to the right, and this time she stepped left and they were past each other. She did not look back. She was fairly certain he did not look back either. She thought about his voice for the rest of the afternoon, which annoyed her considerably. The trouble with Percy Vine began on June the 14th. Percy Vine was not, in the grand taxonomy of dangerous men that populated the West in 1882, a particularly impressive specimen. He was 38, slight, with the kind of restless energy that in some men becomes ambition and in others becomes theft, and in Percy's case had arrived firmly at the latter destination. He had been in redemption for 6 weeks before Nora arrived, having drifted north from Eagle Pass with 2 outstanding warrants and the practiced air of a man who was permanently between legitimate employments. He made the mistake of trying to charm Nora in the manner he had found successful with lonely women in previous towns, which was to say he showed up at Crane's store, leaned on the counter, smiled with the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no convincingly, and began presenting himself as someone he was not. Nora had spent 2 years engaged to Marcus Webb. She had a refined and comprehensive education in men who were presenting themselves as someone they were not. She was polite, in the way that a closed door is polite. She was pleasant, in the way that a fence post is pleasant. She gave Percy Vine nothing that could be mistaken for encouragement. And after 3 visits, he began to understand this, and like many men who had built their sense of self on the ease of their conquests, he took the refusal as something personal. It was Dov Marsh, the salesman, who told Percy, in the way that thoughtless men share information they should keep to themselves, that Nora was managing Arthur Crane's accounts, that she had reorganized his entire bookkeeping system, and had, in the process, discovered a small discrepancy from 2 years prior that had turned out to be a simple arithmetic error, which meant she had a complete and detailed familiarity with everything that moved in and out of that store financially. Percy Vine heard this and spent a long evening thinking about what a woman with that kind of access and that kind of competence might be persuaded to do if the right kind of pressure was applied. He arrived at the store on a Friday evening, half an hour before closing, with a very different proposition than the charm he had previously attempted. Nora heard him out. She listened to his carefully arranged suggestion that she might redirect certain small amounts through the accounts in ways that would benefit them both, that Arthur Crane would never notice given the complexity she had introduced to the books, and that refusal would result in Percy sharing certain information he had acquired about her previous employer in Austin and the reason she had left. She looked at him across the counter for a long, steady moment. "Get out of this store," she said, "and do not come back." Percy had expected fear. He had expected negotiation. He had expected, at the very least, visible distress. He had not expected the absolute, iron quiet of her refusal, and it flustered him more than he would have admitted to anyone. He left, but the look on his face when he went through the door was not the look of a man who was finished. She told Arthur Crane what had happened the next morning. Arthur Crane was a decent man, and he listened carefully, and then he said he would speak to the marshal, a man named Cobb who maintained a loose but generally functional hold on order in redemption. Marshal Cobb listened to Arthur's account, rode out to where Percy Vine was known to be staying, and had a conversation with him that Percy apparently decided did not carry sufficient weight to change his plans, because 3 days later he broke into Crane's store at night and tried to steal the strongbox. He was unsuccessful, as it happened. Crane had anticipated something of the kind and had moved the strongbox. But Percy, furious at the empty drawer, had smashed a considerable amount of the store's interior. And in the morning, when Nora arrived to find the door standing open, and Arthur Crane surveying the damage with the look of a man trying to calculate not just the financial cost, but the insult of the thing, she felt something harden in her stomach that she recognized as the feeling of a situation that was about to get considerably worse before it got better. It was on the morning after the break-in that she encountered Garrett Thorne for the second time, and this time there was nothing incidental about it. She was standing in front of the store when he came out of the marshal's office across the street. She knew, in the way that people in small towns acquire information through the simple mechanism of proximity, that he had been hired to find a man wanted in 2 counties, and that he had delivered the man in question to Marshal Cobb the previous afternoon. She also knew, though she was not entirely certain of the source of this information, that he had not yet left town. He crossed the street with that same unhurried, deliberate stride, and this time he was looking directly at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite concern and not quite curiosity, but was some combination of the two that she had not seen directed at her from a stranger before. "I heard about the break-in," he said when he was close enough that she did not have to raise her voice to answer him. "Good morning," she said. "And yes, it was Percy Vine. Cobb tell you that. I knew before Cobb. I know who has been threatening me." Something moved briefly in his face. "He threatened you directly. He proposed an arrangement," she said. "I declined the arrangement. He apparently felt that breaking through a locked door in the middle of the night was the appropriate response to a business disagreement." Garrett was quiet for a moment, looking at the front of the store, at the broken window that Arthur Crane had already covered with board. Has Cobb done anything about it? He says he will bring Vine in for questioning. He has been saying this since yesterday morning. She kept her voice even, because she had long ago learned that showing frustration to people who were not directly responsible for its source served no functional purpose. I suspect Percy Vine is aware of the pace at which this investigation is proceeding. Garrett looked at her then with the full attention of a man who was not pretending to listen but actually listening, and she had the odd, slightly disorienting sensation of being seen clearly. Not evaluated, not measured for some purpose of his own, simply seen. "I will find him," Garrett said. It was not a question, and not quite an offer. It was a statement of fact about a future event, delivered in the same level tone he seemed to apply to everything. "That is not necessary," she said, automatically, the way she had been saying variations of that sentence for most of her adult life. "I know it is not necessary," he said. "I am going to do it anyway." She was so completely unprepared for that particular combination of words that she could not, for a moment, produce a response to them. He had already started back across the street by the time she found one. "Why?" She called after him. The word came out sharper than she intended. He paused, turned enough that she could see his profile against the morning light. "Because Cobb is moving too slowly, and you are going to keep coming to work here every morning and wondering if today is the day that man decides the next step." She stared at him. "And that," he added, "is not something I am willing to let continue." He walked away, and Nora stood in front of the damaged store and felt something that she recognized, with the precision of long practice, as the absolute refusal to trust it. People said things like that. People made gestures like that. And then the thing that made the gesture possible turned out to be something other than what it appeared. And you were standing in the aftermath of it. And you had the choice between bitterness and bewilderment. And she had already tried both. So she chose instead to simply wait and see. She did not wait long. Garrett found Percy Vine hiding at a homestead 7 miles outside of town, in the company of 2 men who were wanted in their own right, and who made the error of deciding that 3-to-1 odds constituted a reasonable position. They were incorrect in that assessment. Garrett disarmed all 3 without firing a single shot, which was either very impressive or very frightening depending on where you were standing, and delivered them to Marshal Cobb in the early afternoon. Nora heard this from Clara Finch, who had heard it from Edith Parr, who had been standing outside the church when Garrett rode past with the 3 men in front of him, their hands tied to their saddle horns with practiced efficiency. She felt, at the word of this, something shift in the area of her sternum that she would not name for another week. She saw him that evening. He was sitting on the front steps of the hotel with a cup of coffee, watching the street with the particular quality of attention of a man who was never entirely at rest even when he appeared to be doing nothing. She was walking back from the post office, which closed at 5 o'clock, and which she had developed the habit of visiting in the late afternoon, because the walk there and back gave her 20 minutes of thinking time that she found useful. She stopped at the foot of the hotel steps because it seemed rude to walk past without acknowledging what he had done, and Nora Langley was, among her many other qualities, not a rude person. "I heard what you did today," she said. He looked at her without surprise, as though he had expected her to stop. "Vine and his associates are in custody. Cobb has the warrant information. It should hold. I wanted to say thank you. You do not need to." "I know I do not need to," she said, and something that was almost a smile crossed her mouth at the echo of his own words back at him. "I am going to do it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something happen in his expression, something that came and went quickly, like light moving across water there and then gone, though the surface remained different for a moment after. "You are welcome, Miss Langley," he said. "Nora," she said. "My name is Nora, Garrett," he said. "Garrett Thorne." "I know," she said. "The whole town seems to know. That is generally a problem." "Is it?" He considered this with the gravity he seemed to apply to small things as readily as large ones. "It means trouble finds you easily." "And yet you stay," she said, and then was surprised at herself for saying it, because it sounded too much like an observation that was also a question. He did not answer it directly. "I had not quite finished my coffee," he said, which was somehow mysteriously an answer. She said good evening and walked back to the boarding house, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the warm June evening and told herself very firmly not to build anything on the foundation of 3 conversations and 1 act of assistance, because she had done that before, and she knew exactly how it ended. Her heart, unfortunately, was not listening to any part of this sensible speech. Over the following days, it became apparent that Garrett Thorne was in no immediate hurry to leave Redemption. He was waiting, he said, for word from a contact in San Antonio about a contract he had been offered, which could come any day or might take a week. He occupied his time with the specific, disciplined economy of a man accustomed to being between things, cleaning his firearms in the morning, taking his horse out in the late afternoon, reading in the evenings with a seriousness of purpose that she found, somewhat to her own surprise, appealing. She began to see him in the mornings, which was perhaps inevitable in a town the size of Redemption, and what began as polite acknowledgment became gradually a habit of pausing, of exchanging a few sentences about the day or the weather, or something one of them had read or observed, that both of them treated with the careful, unspoken agreement of people who were doing something significant while pretending to do something casual. He was not easy in the way that charming men are easy. He did not fill silence to avoid it. He did not deploy his personality like a salesman presenting a product. He was direct without being blunt, quiet without being remote, and when he asked her something he was genuinely waiting for the answer, which was rarer than it should have been. On the 3rd morning, she told him about Austin, about the schoolhouse, about Harold Peck and his condescending certainty that she should be grateful. She was not sure why she told him. She was not in the habit of sharing things that were unfinished in her. But the way he listened made things come out of her that she had carried quietly and alone for years. "What did you do when he terminated your employment?" Garrett asked. "I finished the week," she said. "I made sure my students' records were in order. I left the classroom cleaner than I had found it, and then I walked out. You did not fight it. It was not an accusation, just an observation, but it landed somewhere. There was nothing to fight," she said. "Harold Peck had the authority. Fighting it would have cost me reputation and energy I needed for something else. Choosing your battles," he said, "always." He was quiet for a moment. "You are very good at being alone for someone who should not have to be." The sentence hit her in the chest like something physical. She looked at him and found him looking back at her with an expression she could not read precisely, but which she felt with great clarity. "That is a very precise observation from a man I have known for 3 days," she said. "I have had 11 years of practice reading people quickly," he said. "It is one of the few things I am genuinely good at." "What are the others?" He considered this. "Shooting, finding people who do not want to be found, coffee when I have the proper equipment." He paused. "I am told I am very poor at small talk." "You are very poor at small talk," she confirmed. "I find it restful." Something crossed his face again, that brief, quickly controlled thing, and she thought, with the precise, frightened clarity of a woman who had been hurt enough times to recognize danger, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She fell in love with him on a Thursday. She did not call it that at the time. She was too careful and too sensible to call it that after 10 days, and she called it instead a development she was monitoring, which she was privately aware was both accurate and absurd. What happened on Thursday was this. Arthur Crane's daughter, a girl of 9 named Frances who came to the store every afternoon after she finished her lessons, fell from the supply ladder and twisted her ankle rather badly. Nora was nearest, caught Frances before she hit the floor completely, and was on her knees on the store floor holding the crying child and trying to assess the injury when the door opened and Garrett came in. He crossed the room without hesitation, crouched down beside them, examined Frances's ankle with the careful, methodical efficiency of someone who had dealt with injuries in the field and knew what he was doing, and said to the crying girl, in a voice so different from his normal tone that Nora almost did not recognize it as his, low and steady and absolutely certain, "You are all right. It is not broken. It is going to hurt for a day or two and then you will be fine. I promise you." Frances stopped crying, not because children always stop crying when adults tell them to, but because something in the certainty of his voice was genuinely credible, and she believed him. And Nora, watching his face as he looked at the child, felt the thing in her chest that she had been refusing to name announce itself with complete and unhelpful clarity. He carried Frances to the doctor's office 2 doors down. He carried her with the same efficient practicality with which he apparently did everything. The child tucked safely against his shoulder, one hand supporting her back, as if this were simply the obvious next action, and there was nothing remarkable about it. When he set her down on the doctor's examination table and stepped back, Frances looked up at him with the specific, uncomplicated trust of a child who had decided about someone, and said, "Will you come back and check on me?" Garrett looked at her for a moment, and something that was not quite a smile, too soft and too real for a smile, moved across his face. "Yes," he said, "I will check on you." He was gone before Nora had finished giving the doctor the details of the fall, and she stood in the street afterward in the afternoon heat and breathed through the terrifying, inconvenient, completely unwelcome reality of what she felt. It was that evening that she told Clara Finch, in the oblique way that women in 1882 could discuss things they were not supposed to name, that she thought the Gunslinger was a more complicated man than his reputation suggested. Clara, who had been widowed at 31 and had spent 12 years since then running a boarding house and understanding people very well, looked at her boarder over the supper dishes with an expression of complete comprehension. "He is still here," Clara said. "He is waiting for a letter that could have been forwarded to the next town he was going to just as easily as waited for here." Nora said nothing. "Just something to consider," Clara said, and carried the dishes into the kitchen. The next morning, Nora arrived at the store and found Garrett already there, standing outside, with 2 cups of coffee from the small place down the street that sold coffee and little else. He held one out to her without preamble, without performance, with the simple matter-of-factness of a man who had decided to do something and had done it. She took it. "The letter came," he said. Her heart performed a small, involuntary contraction. "When do you leave?" She asked and kept her voice level. "That depends on the job," he said. "It is in Laredo, 3 weeks, perhaps 4. He was looking at his coffee, then he looked at her. "I want to ask you something before I go, and I want you to know that the answer will not change anything I have already decided, which is that I will come back through Redemption on my way north when the job is finished." She waited. "I would like to know whether, when I come back through, you would be willing to have supper with me. Not at the boarding house. Somewhere that is the 2 of us with the deliberate intention of it." It was, as proposals went, the least romantic possible phrasing. It was also the most earnest thing anyone had said to her in years, possibly ever, and she felt it in every part of her simultaneously. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing to do that." He nodded once. "Good," he said. "That is all you have to say. Good." "I am working on not being poor at small talk," he said. "Give me some time." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. The laugh came out of her bright and unguarded and surprised, and she saw it do something to him, saw it land on him like light on something that had been in the dark too long, and he looked away, and she thought she had never in her adult life been so exactly simultaneously happy and afraid. He left that afternoon. She told herself, very firmly, for the entire 3 weeks of his absence, that she was not counting the days. She was only keeping a general awareness of the calendar for professional reasons. She was emphatically not lying awake reconstructing his voice in her head, or thinking about the way he had looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup on the morning he left, with that steady, certain quality of attention that felt less like attraction and more like recognition, like something finding where it was supposed to be. She was also, as a matter of factual record, completely lying to herself about all of the above. The town of Redemption continued its business in his absence. Arthur Crane's store recovered from the vandalism of Percy Vine's visit, and Percy himself had been transferred to the county seat in the care of Sheriff Malvern, who had 3 separate jurisdictions interested in his future. Frances Crane healed her ankle within the week, and informed anyone who would listen that the nice man with the gray eyes had promised to check on her. And the fact that she stated this with complete confidence impressed Nora considerably, because she was not sure she had ever managed to believe anything with that kind of uncomplicated faith. She wrote 2 letters during those 3 weeks, neither of which she sent. One was to her mother's cousin in Houston, which she had been meaning to write for months. The other was to Garrett, which she wrote without planning to on a Sunday evening when the boarding house was quiet and everyone else had gone to bed, and which she read over twice in the lamplight, and then folded very carefully and put in the small tin box at the bottom of her traveling bag, because some things needed to be said before they could be let go of. He came back on the 2nd Tuesday of July. She knew the moment he arrived because she heard the particular sound of a horse moving at the end of the day rather than the beginning, that slower, dustier sound, and she was standing at the window of the store before she had consciously decided to move. He rode past slowly, and this time he did look toward the store window, and she stepped back from the glass, which was ridiculous, and she was annoyed at herself for it. But she also put down the ledger she was holding because she was fairly sure she could not do arithmetic in this particular moment. He came to the store 20 minutes later. She was behind the counter and she watched him come through the door, and he was trail-worn and tired and entirely himself. And she said, "You came back," which she had absolutely not intended to say, and which was, she recognized immediately, a fairly comprehensive confession of everything she had been telling herself she was not feeling. "I said I would," he said, and there was something in his voice, a careful quality, like a man holding something that might break. "How are you?" "Better now," she said, which was also a comprehensive confession, and she saw the recognition of this cross his face and settle there as something warm and serious and real. "Supper," he said. "Tonight, if you are free." "I am free," she said. They went to a small establishment at the edge of town, quieter than the saloons, a place that served food at proper tables, and where 2 people could have a conversation without it being a public performance. They sat across from each other, and ate beef and corn bread, and the conversation that began as careful became easier, and the easier became open, and the open became honest in the way that conversations only become honest when two people have independently decided to stop protecting themselves quite so carefully. She told him about Marcus Webb. Not all of it, but the essential shape of it, the 2 years, the discovery, the 3 weeks of rearranging her life around the absence of what she had thought was her future. She told it without self-pity, because self-pity was not something she had much patience for, but she told it honestly. And he listened without interrupting, without offering the premature reassurances that people usually offered when they were more uncomfortable with your pain than interested in it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every person who had the responsibility of protecting you and did not do it instead made you better at not needing it. And the fact that you are better at it does not mean you deserve to have to be." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. "That is," she said carefully, "the most precisely right thing anyone has ever said to me." "I have had a long time to think about similar things," he said. "Tell me about that." So he did, or some of it. He had grown up in East Texas, the son of a farmer who worked hard and died young, the eldest of 4, which meant responsibility arrived early and stayed permanently. He had joined the Rangers at 20, which was common enough, and had been good at the work in the way that people are good at things they have a complicated relationship with. He had left the Rangers at 26 over a matter of orders and conscience that he described briefly and without drama, which told her more about him than a dramatic account would have. He had been doing bounty work since then, which paid well and required nothing of him that involved compromising the particular, specific, unbending sense of right and wrong that he carried like a structural element of his personality. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was the kind of direct question she would not normally ask someone she had known for weeks, but she had begun to understand that directness was the language Garrett Thorne operated most easily in, and she wanted to speak it back to him. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I have been effective," he said. "I have been solvent. I have been in motion." "That is not what I asked." "No," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "I have not been happy in a very long time. I had stopped expecting to be." "What changed?" she asked, and the question hung in the air between them like something irreversible, because they both already knew the answer. "I rode into a town called Redemption," he said, "and nearly walked into a woman coming out of the post office." She breathed through the warmth that moved through her from that, steady and deliberate. "That is a very low bar for personal transformation," she said, "nearly walking into someone." "The nearly is the important part," he said. "I stepped back. I paid attention. That made all the difference." They walked back through the quiet town in the summer dark, not quite touching, both of them very aware of the half-inch of space between them, and at the door of the boarding house he stopped and looked at her in the way he had, that full, unhurried attention. "I would like to stop being in motion," he said. "Or rather, I would like to choose where I stop." She looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am asking for permission to stay." The sentence opened something in her that she had been keeping very carefully closed for a very long time. "You do not need my permission to stay in a town," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking about the town." She reached out and took his hand, which was something she had also not planned, and she felt his fingers close around hers with a care that was the opposite of casual, the opposite of easy, the kind of care that recognizes what it is holding. "Then stay," she said. He walked home in the direction of the hotel through the warm July night, and she went upstairs to her small, clean room and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself, completely and without reservation, be happy. It was beautiful. It was also, as all true things eventually must be, complicated. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Doyle Cutter, which was the kind of name that announced itself accurately. He rode into Redemption on a Friday morning, 12 days after Garrett's return, and the news of his arrival preceded him in the way that bad news always does, traveling faster than the thing itself. Nora heard about it from Edith Parr over breakfast, and Edith delivered the information with the careful, precise neutrality of someone reporting facts they found distressing. Doyle Cutter was, as far as anyone in the territory could tell, the last member of a loose outfit called the Cutter Gang, which had operated out of the Pecos River country for the better part of 3 years, and had been responsible for 4 robberies and 1 killing before the Rangers had disassembled most of them in a series of confrontations the previous year. One of those confrontations had involved Garrett Thorne, who had been the person to bring in Doyle's younger brother Lee for the robbery in Mason County. Lee Cutter had died in the Huntsville prison 6 months later, of causes that were listed officially as fever, and Doyle Cutter had been carrying the intent for revenge in the way that men like him carry things, quietly and with great persistence, for the entire year since. He was asking about Garrett before his horse was stabled. Nora heard this from 3 separate sources in the space of an hour, and the thing that lived in her stomach that recognized danger identified it immediately and spoke up clearly. She went to find Garrett. He was at the marshal's office, which meant he already knew. Marshal Cobb was a decent enough man whose primary problem was that he was the lone law in a territory too large for one man, and his deputy, which meant that his response to most developments was a kind of sustained optimism that occasionally became wishful thinking. He was reassuring Garrett, with the sincerity of a man who was also trying to reassure himself, that Cutter would likely just want to make his position known and move on. Garrett received this assessment with the expression of a man who had extensive professional experience with men like Doyle Cutter, and therefore did not share the optimism. When Nora appeared in the doorway, both men looked at her. She looked at Garrett with all the clear-eyed directness of a woman who had spent too many years managing situations alone to be anything other than direct when something mattered. "I know about Cutter," she said. "I know," Garrett said. "I was going to find you." "You were sitting in the marshal's office being reassured." Cobb looked between them with the expression of a man who recognizes when he has become peripheral to a conversation. "Tell me what you need from me," she said to Garrett. "I need you to stay at the boarding house today," he said. "I need you not to be near me until this is resolved, because he might use me to get to you." "Yes," she held his gaze. "And how do you intend to resolve it? By speaking to him. And if speaking is insufficient?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she heard the answer he was not giving her, the answer that lived in the 11 years of his life that existed before she knew him. "I have no interest in killing anyone," he said, "but I will not let harm come to anyone in this town because of my history." "Your history is not your fault," she said. "Fault is not the relevant question," he said. "The relevant question is what I do with what is in front of me." She wanted to argue. She recognized, with the practical clarity that was one of her particular strengths, that arguing would not serve the situation and would cost him the focus he needed. "All right," she said. "I will be at the boarding house." She turned to leave. "Nora," he said. She turned back. He looked at her with that full, careful attention, and in it she saw everything he was not saying, and she received every word of it clearly. "I will come find you when it is done," he said. She nodded and left, and went to the boarding house and sat in the parlor with Edith Parr and did not allow herself to catastrophize, which was the hardest thing she did that day. And she had done a great many hard things. Doyle Cutter confronted Garrett in the street at midday. Nora was not there for it. She heard the account from Tommy Reeves, who had been watching from the door of the livery, and from Clara Finch, who had been coming from the church, and had stopped in the street when she realized what she was walking into. What happened was not what she had feared. Cutter was not, as it turned out, a man whose grief had become something entirely without humanity. He was a man who had been riding alone for a year with his anger as his only companion, and when he was standing in the street in front of the man who had delivered his brother to the justice that had killed him, what came out of him was not a draw but a question. "Did he suffer?" Doyle asked. The words came out raw, stripped of the aggression he had ridden in with. At the end, "Did Lee suffer?" The silence that followed was long enough that Tommy Reeves was watching from the livery door with his hands flat against the wood, barely breathing. "I do not know," Garrett said. "I was not there, I hope not. For what it is worth, I hope he did not." "He was 19, Doyle said. "He was stupid and he was 19 and he should not have died in a prison." "No," Garrett said, "he should not have." The conversation that followed was not witnessed by Tommy or Clara, who were too far away to hear clearly. But it ended with Doyle Cutter turning his horse and riding out of Redemption in the direction of Del Rio, and with Garrett standing in the street alone for a long moment before he turned and walked toward the boarding house. He knocked on the front door. Clara opened it and called up the stairs, and Nora came down and she looked at him in the doorway, whole and present and real, and felt the relief hit her so physically that she had to hold the banister. "It is done," he said. "Come in," she said. "Come sit down." He came in, and she brought him coffee from the kitchen, and they sat in the parlor together, not talking immediately, and she put her hand over his on the table between them, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they were quiet for a long time in the way of two people who do not need to fill the space between them with words to know that they are not alone in it. "You are not going to leave," she said eventually. It was not a question. "No," he said. "I want to be sure about that," she said, "because I have built a great many things on temporary foundations and I am not willing to do that again." He looked at her, the full, steady look. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "Not without you, and not for something that is not worth it. I have been in motion for 11 years. I know the difference between moving because you have to and moving because you have not yet found the reason to stop. And you have found it now." "I found it in the first 10 days," he said. "I went to Laredo because I had already committed to the job and I do not break commitments. But I was thinking about coming back from the first morning I rode out." She looked at him, and the thing that she had been careful with, careful and guarded and responsible about, simply opened. "I love you," she said. It came out very quietly, in the particular tone of a true thing being said without armor. "I have been trying not to say that because it is too soon by any reasonable measure, but I think you deserve to know it, and I think I deserve to say it." The look that moved across his face was not the look of a man receiving information. It was the look of a man recognizing something he had already known and had been afraid to name, and she saw it happen to him, saw the thing that he had been holding steady behind his eyes come forward, and he said, "I love you," with the same lack of decoration, the same direct honesty, the same care in the saying of it that he applied to every true thing. They sat together in Clara Finch's parlor in the afternoon heat of a Texas July, holding hands across the table, and the future spread out in front of them like country they had not mapped yet, but intended to learn. The month that followed was the best month of Nora Langley's adult life. This was not because it was without difficulty. Garrett was making decisions about his work and his future that were genuinely complicated, and she had her own. There was the question of what permanent life in Redemption looked like, and whether it was what either of them actually wanted, and what the realistic shape of a life built between two people who had both spent years building lives designed for one looked like. These were real questions with no easy answers, and they talked about them with the directness that was the language they had found together. But there were also mornings when he brought coffee to the store and stayed long enough for the kind of conversation that starts as information exchange and becomes something else, something warm and alive and mutual. There were evenings when they walked the length of the town in the long summer dark, and he told her about East Texas and the particular quality of light on the Neches River in the fall, and she told him about the students she had taught, and the books she loved, and the things she still wanted to do and see and make of her life. He listened to all of it with the seriousness he gave everything, and the effect of being listened to by someone who was genuinely paying attention was, she found, something she had been hungrier for than she knew. He was also, as she discovered in the way that you discover things about people when proximity increases, a man of considerable depth that his economy of expression had obscured. He read more widely than she had expected, had opinions about things she would not have predicted, was capable of an extremely dry humor that appeared so infrequently that it had the quality of an unexpected gift, and was, in the specific domain of caring about the things he cared about, the most thorough person she had ever encountered. He fixed a loose board on Clara Finch's front porch without being asked, because he noticed it was loose. He checked on Frances Crane, as promised, twice a week until the girl's ankle was fully healed, and the girl herself declared him her second favorite person in redemption, a designation he received with the same gravity he gave everything, and which made Nora love him so much it was almost inconvenient. He sat with old Jacob Moss, who ran the livery and whose wife had died in May, for an hour on Tuesday evenings because Jacob was lonely and Garrett had noticed this and decided to do something about it. He did these things without announcing them and without apparent expectation of recognition, and she might not have known about half of them if she had not been paying the kind of attention to him that she was now paying. "You are a better person than your reputation suggests," she told him one evening. "My reputation is not entirely inaccurate," he said. "I have done things I am not proud of. There are men who have good reason to think of me as dangerous. Having a use for violence is not the same as being defined by it." "No," he said, "but it is not nothing." "I know it is not nothing," she said. "I am not asking you to pretend it is nothing. I am saying that the whole of you is larger than the part of you that knows how to do what you do." He looked at her with an expression she had learned to identify as the one that meant he had received something that had landed in a place that mattered and was deciding what to do with it. "You are very good at knowing people," he said. "I am very good at knowing you," she corrected. "Which is a different skill." He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with such care that she felt the breath go out of her, and he said, very quietly, "I spent 11 years being very efficient and very alone, and I had made a kind of peace with that. And then I met you, and I cannot figure out how I thought that was acceptable." "I had made a kind of peace with it too," she said. "Then we were both wrong," he said, "which is at least symmetrical." She laughed, and he smiled, and she thought for the 100th time that his smile was one of the best things she had ever seen, because of how rarely it appeared and how completely real it was when it did. There was one more storm to pass through before things settled. Her past came to redemption in the last week of July, in the person of Marcus Webb. She recognized him from across the street before he saw her, which gave her exactly 45 seconds to process the sight of him and decide how she intended to proceed. He looked much the same as he had the last time she had seen him, well dressed in the manner of a man who spent money on appearance, dark-haired, handsome in the conventional way that had initially attracted her attention during their courtship, before she understood that the surface was the most substantial part of him. He saw her and started toward her, and she stood still and waited, because Nora Langley did not run from things. "I have been looking for you," he said when he reached her. His tone managed to convey both grievance and entitlement simultaneously, which was a combination she had once found puzzling and now found merely exhausting. "I did not make my location secret," she said. "I am working and living here. What do you want, Marcus?" "I want to talk to you." "You had 2 years to talk to me. You used them to maintain a second arrangement in Houston that you declined to mention." He had the particular discomfort of a man confronting the full clarity of his own actions in the flat light of someone else's honesty. "I want to explain," he said. "It was more complicated than you understood." "I understood it very well," she said. "What is it you actually want, not explain, want?" He looked at her with the slightly wounded air of a man who had always received the benefit of the doubt and had never quite recovered from the first person who withdrew it. "I thought, perhaps, if we spoke, that you might reconsider." She looked at him, and she felt with complete clarity the absence of anything. Not anger, not residual hurt, not the particular ache of something that had been important. Simply the clean, empty space where the last 2 years of investment had been, and on the other side of it, with complete precision, the knowledge of what she was going toward. "No," she said. "I am not interested in reconsidering." "You are here alone," he said. "In a town in the middle of nowhere, managing a store account. Is this really what you wanted?" "I am not alone," she said. She heard the steps behind her before she saw Marcus's expression change, and she turned to find Garrett at her shoulder, not having appeared from nowhere specifically, but having observed this particular situation from the general direction of the feed store, and arrived with the unhurried, certain timing that was characteristic of him. He did not say anything threatening. He did not position himself aggressively. He simply stood beside her, and the fact of his standing there, the physical statement of it, was entirely sufficient. Marcus looked at Garrett with the assessing calculation of a man measuring a situation and arriving at an unfavorable conclusion for himself. "Who is this?" Marcus asked, directed at Nora. "The person I am with," she said. Marcus looked between them, and then he said, with the clinging, desperate quality of a man making a final argument he knows has already failed, "You deserve more than this town. You deserve more than this." "I deserve exactly what is in front of me," Nora said, "and so do you. Go home, Marcus." He left. He was gone by the next morning, and Nora watched his coach depart from the window of the store and felt nothing except a clean, complete certainty. Garrett appeared at the counter beside her. "Are you all right?" "More than all right," she said. "Are you?" "I am fine." "You did not say anything to him." "You did not need me to," he said. "You handled it completely." "You were there," she said. "That mattered." He looked at her. "It always will be," he said. "I need you to know that. Whatever comes, whatever shows up, whatever history either of us carries, I will be there." The words moved through her like something she had been waiting to hear so long she had stopped knowing she was waiting. "Nobody ever fought for me before," she said. The words were quiet and entirely honest. "Nobody ever just stood next to me and said, 'I am here, this is where I am, and that is not changing.'" He looked at her with the full, steady truth of his gray-green eyes. "Get used to it," he said, simple as that, certain as gravity. A fact about the future delivered with the same matter-of-fact confidence with which he said everything he meant entirely. She reached up and took his face in both hands and kissed him right there in the window of Arthur Crane's general store, where anyone walking down the main street of Redemption, Texas, on a Tuesday in July of 1882 could see, and she did not care at all, and neither did he. Arthur Crane, coming through the back with a crate of dry goods, looked at the two of them and set the crate down and went back through the door to give them a minute. which was, Nora later told him, the most gentlemanly thing anyone had done for her in recent memory. Garrett proposed to her on the first day of August. He did it in the way she might have predicted if she had been thinking about it in advance, which she had been, mostly late at night when she was supposed to be sleeping. He did it without elaborate staging, without the performance of romantic gesture, without deploying the charm that he did not particularly have in the first place. He did it by sitting across from her on the steps of the boarding house in the evening light, turning his hat in his hands for a moment in the single gesture of nervousness she had ever seen from him, and saying, "I would like to marry you, if you are willing. I want to build a life here with you or somewhere else if that is what you want, but I want it to be together and I want to know that it is permanent." She waited deliberately just for a moment. "Are you making me wait?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Is that a no?" "It is absolutely not a no." "Then what are you doing?" "I am enjoying the fact that Garrett Thorne, who has never been nervous about anything in 11 years, is nervous right now." He looked at her with an expression that was simultaneously reproachful and something much warmer than reproach, and said, "Nora." "Yes," she said, "I will marry you. I would very much like to marry you." The hat stopped turning in his hands. "Good," he said. "That is all you have to say. Good. You told me you found my lack of small talk restful," he said. "I am reconsidering my position." He reached over and took her hand and held it with the care that she had come to understand was his primary language for what he felt. And she sat beside him on the steps of Clara Finch's boarding house, and the evening light spread over redemption, and the future was present and real and entirely theirs. They married in September. Nora wore a dress that she and Edith Parr had made together over 3 weeks of evenings, cream-colored with a simple collar, practical in the way she was practical about most things, and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are exactly right. She carried sage and late summer wildflowers from the field behind the boarding house that Frances Crane had picked that morning with the complete confidence of a 9-year-old who knew exactly what was appropriate for the occasion. Garrett stood at the front of the church in the cleanest clothes she had ever seen him wear, which still managed to look like his own. And when she came down the aisle, he watched her with an expression that he made no effort to compose into something more neutral. And she saw on his face everything that she felt moving through her in that moment, open and real and without reservation. They spoke their vows to each other in the direct, clear language that was the language of both of them, without elaborate poetry, without performed sentiment. When he said he would love and protect her, it was not a promise made to satisfy a ritual. It was a statement of ongoing fact, delivered in the voice of a man who meant exactly what he said and always had. She said afterward, to Clara Finch, that the vows felt less like a ceremony and more like a confirmation of something that had been true since July. Clara said that was exactly what vows were supposed to feel like, and that most people simply missed it. They took the house at the edge of town that had been sitting empty since spring, a solid 2-room structure with a kitchen and a covered porch that faced west, and they made it theirs over the course of October and November, in the manner of 2 people who had each spent years living in spaces that belonged to their circumstances rather than themselves. Nora put curtains on the windows and books on the shelf that Garrett built along the parlor wall. Garrett repaired the porch and the fence and the roof, with Tommy Reeves assisting on the days his own work allowed. And in the evenings they cooked together in the kitchen and ate at the table, and the domesticity of it, the sheer warm simplicity of it, was the most extraordinary thing either of them had encountered. He was still figuring out what work looked like in a life that was no longer organized around constant motion. He had a reputation and a set of skills that had value, and there was a legitimate need for experienced men willing to work with law enforcement in a territory still finding its shape. He talked with Marshal Cobb about a different kind of arrangement, one that allowed him to take cases within a reasonable radius rather than ranging across 3 states. And Cobb, who was practical about his own limitations, received this suggestion with considerable relief. It was not entirely without risk, and they both knew it. But it was honest work, done by someone with the competence and the conscience to do it right, and she had never asked him to be someone other than who he was. She continued working for Arthur Crane through the fall, and by spring, she had begun teaching 2 afternoons a week in the schoolroom that the town had been managing without a qualified teacher for the better part of a year. The children of redemption acquired, in the spring of 1883, an instructor who held the firm conviction that education was a matter of justice as much as opportunity, and who applied to the teaching of mathematics and history and grammar the same direct, clear, thorough intelligence that she applied to everything she undertook. Frances Crane was in the first group of her students, which pleased both of them considerably. In the spring of 1883, Nora told Garrett she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, over coffee, in the direct, quiet way of a woman delivering true information, and she watched him receive it. She watched it move through him, saw the thing behind his eyes that she had learned over months to read like a language, and what she saw was something she did not have a precise name for but which she recognized as a man feeling the full weight of a future arriving, feeling it and not stepping back from it, feeling it and standing in it, with both feet on the ground. He came around the table and held her with the careful, complete certainty that was the physical expression of everything he felt, and she held him back in the quiet of their kitchen in the morning light, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because some things are larger than the words available for them. Their son was born in October of 1883, a healthy, demanding, entirely compelling child whom they named Daniel, after Garrett's father, and who arrived in the world with the expression of someone who had made a definitive decision about it already. He had Nora's dark eyes and Garrett's serious, assessing quality of attention, which he deployed on the faces of everyone who came near him with the comprehensive thoroughness of a very small person accumulating information. Clara Finch, who was present for the birth along with the doctor, said afterward that she had never seen a man look at a child the way Garrett looked at Daniel in the first minutes of his life. She said it quietly, to Edith Parr, who said that she was not entirely surprised. Garrett held his son with the same care he applied to everything that mattered, and the adjustment from the life he had lived to this one, a life of permanence and responsibility, and love in the specific, daily demanding form that love takes when it is fully realized, was not always simple or easy. There were nights when the old habits of solitude pulled at him, when the weight of being needed felt different from the freedom of being unattached, and he talked to Nora about this with the honesty that was the foundation of what they had built. And she listened, and did not require him to be only the things that were easy about himself. She had her own adjustments. The years of managing alone, of not expecting anyone to stay, did not simply dissolve in the light of a man who had chosen her and kept choosing her. There were moments when the old expecting to be left feeling arrived uninvited, when something in him said the wrong thing or the day went badly, and she had learned to name it when it happened instead of carrying it quietly until it became something else. "I know this is real," she said to him one evening, sitting on the porch while Daniel slept inside. "I know it is real, and I still sometimes wait for the part where it is not." "I know," he said. "I still sometimes think I am going to wake up somewhere on the road between here and the last place, and this will have been the dream." They looked at each other in the porch light, "It is not a dream," she said. "No," he said. "It is better than anything I dreamed." Daniel took his first steps in February and said his first clear word in April, which was not mama or papa but rather horse, delivered with considerable conviction while pointing at Jacob Moss's gray mare through the livery fence, which Jacob found very flattering. He grew through the year with the specific, astonishing speed of children, his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and to both his parents combined exasperation and pride, an early and comprehensive independence of will that suggested he had arrived in the world with very clear ideas about how it should be operated. Garrett taught him the names of the stars, because it was one of the things he himself had known since childhood that had always seemed important, and Nora read to him every evening. And together, they gave him the specific combination of roots and wings that is the greatest gift parents can provide, the knowledge of being held absolutely, alongside the knowledge that the world was wide and worth exploring. Their second child, a girl they named Anna, arrived in the spring of 1886 and announced herself immediately as her brother's complement. Where Daniel was serious, Anna was effervescent. Where he observed, she participated. And together, they were the most comprehensive argument either Garrett or Nora had ever encountered against the possibility of quiet. Redemption itself had grown. The Methodist Church no longer had a theological roof situation. There was a proper school building, where Nora taught full-time now, and a second general store and a telegraph office, and the roads were better, and more families had come, and the town was becoming something with the specific weight of a place that intended to continue. Marshall Cobb had retired in 1885 and had been replaced by a younger man named Silas Odom, who was competent and had the particular advantage of not being primarily optimistic, and who worked well with Garrett in the way that practical people work well together when they have the same basic orientation toward what constitutes appropriate action. There was a moment, one evening in the fall of 1886, when Daniel was 3 and Anna was a few months old, and Nora was sitting on the porch with the baby in her arms in the golden late afternoon light, and Garrett came home to find this particular scene arranged precisely as it was, and he stopped at the gate for a moment before coming through it. She saw him stop. She watched him stand there looking at her and the children and the house and the life, and she saw on his face, unguarded in the moment before he realized she was watching him, the full weight of everything he felt. And what she saw was not complicated. It was not ambivalent or complex or carefully managed. What she saw was a man who had come home and who knew exactly what home meant, and who was, without reservation or qualification, exactly where he intended to be. He came through the gate and up the porch steps and bent to kiss her, and she shifted the baby to one arm and put her free hand on his face, and he sat down beside her. And Daniel immediately climbed into his lap with the sovereign confidence of a child who considers his father's lap to be personal property. "Good day," she asked. "Good enough," he said. "Better now." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and Daniel sat solemnly against his father's chest, holding a small carved horse that Arthur Crane had given him for his birthday. And Anna slept in her mother's arms in the warm afternoon air, and the sun moved toward the horizon in the way it moved in that part of Texas, slowly and with great color, turning everything it touched to gold. She thought about the word he had said to her on the steps of Clara Finch's boarding house on a July evening 4 years ago, 3 months before their wedding, the one that had opened something in her that had been closed for a very long time. Get used to it, she had. She had gotten used to being fought for, chosen, stood beside, considered, seen clearly, held carefully, returned to. She had gotten used to the particular, extraordinary ordinariness of a life shared with someone who meant every word they said. She had gotten used to trust, which was the most difficult thing she had ever done, and the most worthwhile. She looked at Garrett's profile in the last of the afternoon light, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the way he was watching their son with the same full attention. He gave everything that mattered. And she felt, with the complete and unambiguous certainty of something long tested and proven, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I love you," she said. It still came out quietly, in the same particular tone it had always had, a true thing said without armor. He turned to look at her, the gray-green eyes that she had been trying to name a color for since the first time she had looked into them, and on his face was everything, and he said, "I love you," in the same direct, undecorated, utterly reliable way he said every true thing he had ever said to her. The sun finished its work on the horizon, the light going from gold to copper to a warm, deep rose, and the evening came in soft and full over Redemption, Texas, in the fall of 1886, and the life they had built together held them in it like something sure and solid and real. And from the small, covered porch of a house at the edge of town, it was exactly enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.